good thing is you're gonna talk about Paul. Jay's gonna talk about Paul. So we'll talk about Stephen today. But interesting tie-in and maybe a good introduction to Paul later. And what happened with Stephen and Saul, who was one of his persecutors, and the spread of the gospel as a result. So. Yeah, each of my slides. So just the context here so everybody's aware of the story. This is the early church in Jerusalem, which is pretty much confined to Jerusalem. I'll talk a little about Stephen's story and then some of the principles that came out of that and around courage and lessons for us. And then a question around how we would apply, in our situation, the relevance for today. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about this story that I just mentioned, the unbroken of courage and redemption. All right. So there was this is just as a context. In the early Christian church, there were two groups. There were the Hebrew Christian Jews who spoke Aramaic. It was a Semitic language in Jerusalem. And then there were the Hellenists, which were Christian Jews who spoke Greek. And this is, I'm talking about in the church setting. So essentially, if you picture it, there's two languages, two ethnic groups in a church. And that was the trade language. Many of those Hellenists had come from other places outside of Palestine. So it was very different practices and cultures. There was quite a clash there. Very interesting. And as part of, later on, I want to talk a little bit about, our position as a church. We're growing. We're expanding to Cambridge. There's a different, whole different community there, different customs, practices maybe, in terms of, going to church or building a new church. And so they were presented with some challenges, and I'd just like us to think a little bit about the relevant, the application of that in this situation. Then there was the council, and this is the council that Stephen had to go before, and that was essentially the Supreme Court appointed by Rome. They were in charge of the religious, civil, and criminal, and they had their own police force. And in the case, it was interesting, in the case of any attack on the temple, they could basically do whatever they chose. They could kill somebody, basically, if it was a threat to the temple itself. So they'd be given that kind of authority. And the issue or the problem that presented itself was that the Hellenist widows, and these would be so they were in the church, right? But they were Hellenists, and they were not being cared for by the church. They were basically being ignored. And this is because that was a reflection of Jewish society at that time. They just didn't take care of the widows. And particularly because, majority, it was more of the Hebrews were sort of in the majority, and they hadn't really even thought about it. So, sort of a blind spot, if you will. So I'm going to challenge me thinking about, us as a church, do we have any blind spots like that we're not even aware of, perhaps? Okay, Dave? So in Acts 6, it starts, the number of disciples were multiplying, and there was a complaint that was brought against the Hebrews by the Hellenists because the widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. And again, they didn't have the welfare system back then. How many people remember in Vermont the poorhouse? Anybody know about the poorhouse in Vermont? So this is as early as the 60s, Reg? I believe it was the 60s. Many Vermont towns had what they called the poorhouse. And in fact, a house that I built over in the Cambridge area was built on where the poorhouse was located. And so what happened was that when people were really destitute, the town had a property, and you would go to this place and you grow vegetables, and people would bring food to that place. This is prior to the welfare system really coming along. So they were, similar system. There was the church was providing the welfare, the food for the people. And interestingly, the apostles were struggling with trying to run the ministry, and at the same time, pastors, we expected to do everything, right? So what they did was decide to select 7 of the Hellenists. So these are where the complaints were coming from. So instead of sort of deciding as the majority, they said, well, you guys, you figure it out and you run it. So they selected 7 men that had a good reputation, wisdom and the Holy Spirit, and then so that they could focus on the ministry. And they, in the course of that, chose Stephen. And they also commissioned them, laid hands on them, and then, immediately the word of God spread, disciples multiplied, there was a lot of growth happening. Well, Stephen was more than just sort of the food administrator. He was out there really evangelizing. He was very effective in ministry. And he was doing some pretty amazing things. And then, of course, whenever that happens, what's going to happen as a result of that? What do you expect? There's some opposition, and it's from within the church. It's not even from outside. But they were particularly in the Hebrew area, and this is a group called the Synagogue of Freedom, which is a coalition of different sort of ethnic, different areas, people from different areas. But they basically cooked up a scheme. They induced people to make charges about him, saying that he had blasphemed against Moses, things that he said Jesus would destroy the temple and change the customs of Moses. Of course, for them, Moses was, right? That was it. And so all who sat in the council, when they had charged him, and all who sat in the council saw his face, the face of an angel. So go ahead. Okay. So this is the Stephen in front of the council of Sanhedrin. There were 71 of them, by the way, and it was quite a formal hearing. And of course, you know about the stoning that happened, the trial, and essentially the murder of Stephen. Okay. So the message that he gave them, he confronted them. He said, and it goes quite long, a chapter and a half, I think, basically. Not a real popular sermon on how to win friends and influence people. But basically he told them, you've consistently rejected the message from God and his prophets. The other thing he told them was that people could worship outside Jerusalem and even outside the temple. Now, we're talking, everything was in Jerusalem and everything was in the temple for them. And then God could and did liberate people anywhere. And again, they all felt it had to be centered around their little circle within their building. And again, challenge for us. Can things happen outside of our physical building, in our community and in our world? And then, I think he really got at them with this, the problem was not with the intellect, it's not how smart you are in figuring this all out, but it's with the will. That's really where the issue was for them, was their will. Okay, Dave? So the story then goes on to Stephen's stoning, and many of you know this story. And as it was happening, he gazed into heaven, saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand, the Son of Man. He cried out with a loud voice. When they were running, they were just so inflamed that they ran out there together. And there was the witnesses laid down their clothes, and a young man named Saul was there. So he was one of the persecutors. This is the first time we hear about Saul. They stoned Stephen, and he's calling out to God, saying, Lord, receive my spirit. And he knelt down and cried with a loud voice, Lord, do not charge them with this sin. Does that sound like anything familiar? What did we hear? What's similar? What did Jesus say?
Forgive them.
Forgive them, and they know not what they do. So there's sort of a, very similar spirit, and then knelt down and fell asleep. And then the interesting at that time, this persecution arose, so Saul was leading the charge on the persecution. Here's the interesting thing, that persecution is what caused the church to grow. Because they had to flee Jerusalem, and they spread out all over Samaria, Judea, and beyond. And that was really the beginning of the diaspora and the gospel going out. And then afterward, several men buried Stephen, and then of course the story of Saul goes on there about what he did after that. So next one, Dave. So some of the principles I looked, in terms of what are the principles that we could apply and learn from. In any case, and this is easy to say, and for us, we're not challenged with this. And I've read recently, and I have colleagues at work that are in China, that are Chinese Christians, You know, and they tell me there's a lot more freedom today than there was 20 or 30 years ago, but they're certainly taking big chances, you know. They move their little house churches every few months. They can't get larger than a certain size, or the government gets nervous, so they're threatened by. They're okay with smaller ones, but as soon as it gets large enough, they have to split off. And so, you know, and they're also their careers and their livelihoods are at stake. We don't have anything like that. I don't think we can even relate to that. There's another book I also recommend you read called Heavenly Man, and it's about a Chinese pastor that really did suffer persecution, and he's living in the West today in Germany, but quite a story about, you know, what he went through in China. So risking your lives to do what is right, risking your reputation, being bold and representing Christ to others, and there's things that are really common to the people of courage in the Bible. They ask for the power of the Holy Spirit to give them courage. You don't generate that courage within yourself. You can't possibly do it yourself. It has to come from another source. Look for opportunities. So that's an interesting one, and it caused me to think, well, what are we doing? What am I doing? Where, you know, finding the small opportunities that are out there to present the opportunity to share a faith. And then, you know, this is one. Realizing discomfort is not persecution, so it's maybe uncomfortable sharing, but it's not persecution, and we can't even compare or fathom that, I think, for us. And then the other interesting thing is start small. I mean, in Stephen's case, he was in charge of feeding the widows. It wasn't probably the largest, maybe most important job, or seen that way at first, but he started small, and God blessed him, and he used his ministry. And the courage will grow as we trust in God. And it grows from the presence of Christ in our lives. You know, in 1 John he talks about, I've overcome the world. So he gives us that courage, you know, to share with others. Okay, Dave? And some of the other lessons I mentioned about striving for excellence in small things, that's Stephen did an outstanding job in ministering, but it prepared him for greater things. And a real understanding of God leads to practical and compassionate action for others. So, you know, in the case of Stephen, it really started with a problem that where widows were not being taken care of. And it's interesting that sometimes I think we sort of spiritualize all this, and we don't understand the real practical application in the actions that people see that bring them closer to God. And that particular, and God always starts with that. And then certainly understanding the gifts that we have and using those. And in Stephen's case, he was probably an effective administrator, but he was also obviously had other gifts that he used. Okay, Dave? So one of the, and it's not directly related to courage, but the issue that had come up, I mentioned about the widows, and this was really I think at its root, it wasn't just the widows weren't being fed, there was this sort of ethnic divide, right? There was these two groups there. And how did they respond? You know, interestingly, they sat down with the people that were having the complaint or the issue and met face to face with them. They listened and acknowledged their concerns. Then they selected the leaders from the people who were affected, so they got them involved in the solution. And they commissioned the leaders and gave them authority. You know, I think it's real exciting what's happening in Cambridge and how, you know, the church here is sponsoring that and how we can commission that, and we'll be developing leaders. I'm certain we have to develop leaders in order for it to grow. We first have to have, you know, that core group, but that will be really critical. So that's an example of how the church can grow. And then they shared power and resources. So, you know, it's more than just providing a voice to it. They also put real resources behind it. Okay. So, you know, I mentioned, you know, we're in some ways, and I've actually experienced this before, in a period of real sort of success and growth, and that actually can be a dangerous time. It's a very exciting time. It's positive, but it can also have its challenges. And so, you know, in asking the question, for us, are there any sort of I call them mindsets. The work that I do a lot with Pfizer is with leadership around the way people are thinking and for improving processes and getting people. Many people are sort of in a pattern and they don't even know it. And how do you get yourself out of that? You know, to be thinking about different ways to do things. Sometimes we put in improvements and then 6 months later it's gone right back to where it was. So that's because fundamentally the mindsets haven't changed. I mean, you know, people can see there's an improvement, but they just more comfortable with the way it was, or, and you know, what are the mindsets that we pick up from our culture or society that may not necessarily be biblical, and maybe we may be blind to, that could cause a division? So I'll just pose that as a question. Are there any? You know, you can think historically. What are some examples of that historically, where, you know, even in the church there were these attitudes or beliefs that, you know, we look back on and go, how can people have thought that way? But what are some examples of that historically?
How you do church?
Okay, yeah, maybe interesting. Yeah, style of service.
Or old, you know, you get the high church and you get
the hymns and the high church and the low church and the rockin' church.
I think it's complex for us. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world."
Yeah.
So he therefore refused to make it like a political entity. And at the time that Jesus was standing before Pilate, the way that you advanced your religious agenda was to make it, to give it legs. I mean, it had to have some kind of political impact.
Right.
And that's a challenge for us too. I mean, you know, I remember one time talking to somebody from another church, and they said to me, "Well, I don't see how you can be a Democrat and go to heaven." I mean, it was that blunt. It was like, that was a direct equation because of perceived attitudes about various social issues and so on. And I don't think we need to go there. I just don't need to go there. I mean, politics is politics, and yet there's always, even with the primaries and everything, there's a lot of pressure, you know, about interpreting where parties stand and so on. So I think we gotta be more nuanced about that.
Right.
It does not mean we don't have values.
Right.
It just means that Jesus has a plan that's bigger than whatever the demographics are or the political structure in any given country. It's easy for us to see that for Chinese people.
Yeah. But for ourselves. Have any of you lived in the South or from the South? Anybody? Dave, the Southern. I went to graduate school in South Carolina, and the first thing I did, I always wanted to go to a black church. So quite an experience. Very friendly, very welcoming. You know, there was no such thing as like an end time. And they were pretty close to flipping on the pews, but it was, you know, a great experience. But in that, you know, I think for us it's just so foreign.
Yeah.
But if you've been in the South, there's a very distinct sort of black church culture and white church culture, and
right. Never
the
the
two
twain.
of them.
Right.
But you know, again, where we are, I guess it's not. It just isn't. But what are the maybe more subtle things in our culture?
We've got all the denominational issues.
That's a good one. I didn't even think of that.
I mean,
Yeah.
we argue over stupid stuff.
Yeah.
I think, Andy, too, that values that may not seem to be biblically oriented are quite biblically oriented.
Yeah.
They're just stated differently.
Yeah.
And I think the mindset, I think, is a very powerful deterrent to positive change, which makes me think about tradition is another one of those areas that prevent us, that can cause division, it can prevent us from growth.
Yeah, tradition very powerful, isn't it?
Yeah.
And do we have subcultures in Franklin County? Are there, you know, when we look at it, are there sort of these cultures that we just don't interact with, or?
Well, certainly from the economic perspective, yes. Religious perspective, yes.
I think,
You see that?
like yourself.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we were always a distinct subculture within any community that we were in.
Yeah.
And it happened to be Baptist. It didn't matter what it was, but we knew the rules, and we knew that we were probably a little better than all them other folk. I think that can be a problem for a church, of just getting an us-them. Jesus just didn't seem to do that. I mean, he was always hanging around with the wrong people, and yet never lost his values and his clarity about the kingdom culture. So yeah.
I can still remember the preacher's kid walking into the barber shop once a month, and every time I walked into that barber shop, the barber would say, "Here comes the preacher's kid, watch out for that one."
Yep.
I thought you were going to say, clean up your language. And, you know, I mean, we're moving into a new community, forming a new church. The practices and beliefs and the traditions that we have, are they going to be sort of like just dropped over there, or?
We're moving into a new age group.
Ah,
The vision and mission of Cambridge is to reach young adults and children. And that's, you know, for us that are a little bit older than young adult and children, that's a whole mind shift in itself. Then how do you do church? And what does it look like?
yeah.
And
A little
what
more
does-
chaotic, probably, huh?
Probably. Do you, yeah, it's
Yeah.
gonna be interesting.
Yeah.
Experiment.
Right. So, okay, so anyway, just posing the thought, something to think about, and then the last question here is that, you know, how would the gospel challenge us to change? Are we willing to take risks and be courageous? And, you know, earlier, you know, make those small steps. What are those small steps that we can take? So I wanted to pose a couple of those thoughts, and I don't want to lose my friend Dave, because he's got a big game tonight. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this other story, because I think it's very powerful, and it might be one that we could utilize as well. So before, yeah.
And I'm sorry, could you just go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
please?
Back one slide, Dave.
Put it back up.
Yep. This one?
This is killing me, I'll tell you. This really is, because how many people have gotten PhDs from writing things like that in the last 30 years? When you think about it, 2,000 years ago, they were talking about inclusion, you know, empowerment, listening to people. I'm awed with this,
Yeah.
that this was brought from Christ.
Yeah, and certainly, I think it's one of the sources of the growth in our church has been that empowerment of people to take it and run with it, you know, with the ministry, and not sort of micromanage it to the point that nobody wants to do anything, you know. And I've seen that happen, and it really dampens that. But that's a good point. So these principles, they were valid, you know, 2,000 years ago, they're valid today, and they'll be valid in the future, so. Yeah. The other interesting thing for me was that I kind of always idealized the early church, like that was the ideal.
Yeah.
And then you read about it, they were just as dysfunctional as we are.
Trying to figure it out, right?
And, you know, I think understanding that, you know, gives us a little more ability to learn from that.
Yeah.
So. Okay, Dave. Let's go to I think I had the last slide. Yeah. So this story, Unbroken, the author, Laura Hildbrand, wrote this book called Seabiscuit, which I've never seen, but people say it's a great story.
Great book, yeah.
So she wrote this book Unbroken, and it is just powerful. She's an interesting person herself. She suffers from chronic fatigue syndrome and basically can't leave her house. So she has to interview people from her house and then write these incredible research stories, you know. But this story, this Louis Zamperini, he was born in New York City but moved to California when he was young. And he was a juvenile delinquent. He was in trouble with the law all the time as a teen. And then discovered that he was a runner, and then sort of channeled all that into his running. And he was running like a 4-minute, 7-second mile. This was well before, this is like in 1930s. So Roger Bannister, right, broke the 4-minute mile. You know, people know that story about Roger Bannister, that they said it was physically impossible. You know, they'd study it. There was no way you could break the 4-minute mile. And what was it, in 50, when did that one was about?
Somewhere around there.
60?
Somewhere around there.
Yeah.
It was like 54, I think.
Oh,
I'm not
yeah.
sure.
54, yeah, it was 50, it was in the 50s. But up to that point, there was this sort of mental barrier, and Zampieri had decided he was gonna break it, and he had gotten within like 6 seconds of that, and he was still improving. And what happened was, the war broke out, they canceled the Olympics, he basically signed up for the Air Force and became a bombardier pilot. Incredible stories there. He was in a plane that was basically had, I think, 400 shell holes in it, and barely made it back, and only he and the pilot had survived. Incredible story there. And then another time he's out in the Pacific, and his plane, the engines go down, and he goes down in the Pacific, and he's tangled up in the cabling, and he's going down, he's underwater, and the only reason he could survive is because of his lungs, probably. And he can't remember anything, but he ends up basically on the top, I mean, somehow he broke free of it, and he got up there. He was sure they were going to be, basically he and 2 other guys survived in a raft, and they were sure they were going to be rescued in a day, that day, and 47 days later, they had a couple chocolates and some water. I mean, incredible story. And he weighed like 64 pounds when they finally found him. It was one time they saw a plane coming and they waved. It was a Japanese plane and they shelled them, and they still survived. But they were basically captured by the Japanese, and then so the world had written him off as dead. They'd done his funeral services and all that, but he was a POW for 2.5 years, and just an incredible, powerful story there. There was a guy named the Bird that just tortured him. I mean, incredible. And it's interesting because like 50 years later, he goes back to Japan to find this guy. So I won't go into that part of the story. It's pretty powerful. But and then he comes back and he sort of forgets. He promised God if he survived, and he kind of forgets. But this torture had really done a number on him, and he became an alcoholic. And his wife was ready to leave him. It was a really bad situation. She went to a Billy Graham crusade and became a believer, and then sort of forced him to go. He didn't want to go, but he went, and he did become a believer. And it's quite a story. And then decided to work with boys, teenage boys, and he basically did it through like outdoor activities, and like the outing club type activities, and led a lot of young men to the Lord as well. So it's really quite a story, and it's amazing. It was a #1 bestseller on the New York Times. So the story, his courage, and when he reflects back on his life, he basically said, the reason I survived is because God had a plan for me at the end, and he saw how it all fit together, and that in itself is quite a story. So I'm going to show you just 5 minutes of a video interview, showing the highlights of his life. So Dave, you want to?